Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. We have back, as always, the most anticipated, the one, the only Mr. SG Anon graciously joining us for yet another podcast. And this should be, with no hyperbole, a barn burner because we have a lot to discuss, as you would expect, on the financial and geopolitical front. He's going to help us fill in those proverbial blanks. As always, if you are new to the podcast, please do like, subscribe, and share so it helps the channel grow and others to gain in the knowledge you're afforded. SG, how are you doing this good day, sir?
Doing very well, my friend. And for your audience out there, I just want to highlight, John, that we actually had this broadcast scheduled for yesterday. I had something come up rather suddenly, and you were extremely gracious in flexibility with getting it back on the book. So I really appreciate that, and I want your audience to know that.
I appreciate that. Thanks, SG. That's gracious of you. Thank you. But thanks for making a adjustment for us to do this, because without you, there is no podcast. So thank you for that. Okay, so SG, starting right at the top, I'm going to show you a couple of slides, and we'll walk into this with some visuals to make the point. Let me know when you can see this here.
I can see it now.
Okay, great. So this is according to Majid, you know well. We know about the long and widely anticipated attacks from Israel on the Iranian nuclear power plants, as well as the uranium-rich sites in Tehran. No surprise to you. This is what we believe is the prophetic boom prophesied by the late, great Kim Clement over 15 years ago. So here's one slide, him talking about the reports of an impending change in Iraq. And here's another one I thought was pretty interesting, SG, to get your insights. This came today from Zane. You probably saw it. HSBC is sending internal memos or emails to their various clients. I don't know if it's everyone or certain people. I can't say for certain, but they're sending them out, letting people know that foreign currency payments into the global currency wallet is unavailable at the moment. If they receive it, it will be in the payment of whatever respective country they're in this case, the Great British Pound, as you can see. So I say to you with all of these slides, and of course, I understand, you're not a financial advisor and you don't hold the seat at the table with President Trump, but you still have cogency of knowledge. And that would be based on these events, what you know, what I have now shared with you, how close can the public expect or anticipate to see said reset?
Well, John, it's almost eerie that we should start the conversation out this way because as I've been analyzing everything that's happening in the Middle East right now, and as I've been watching MAGA and various factions of patriots out there, demographically speaking, sort of, having the discourse about what's going on with this Iranian, U.S.-Israeli conflict. It's certainly going to involve Iraq before this process is over. We've got 40,000 American personnel in the Middle East. So I've been tracking, the development of this, and increasingly, it is looking like this is the end game. This is the end point, the final conclusion of getting a tripartite foreign financial system under control. And so what do I mean by that? Well, if we go back to the Q boards and we appreciate what happened during the Hussein presidency between 2008 and 2016, we get a pretty clear picture of what was going on inside of the deep state apparatus and some of its more publicly visible nodes. And Iran was one of those major publicly visible nodes, has been since the late 1970s, early 1980s. Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, is the son of a UK intelligence officer. So it's worth highlighting for the audience out there that this is, again, one of those situations of look here, not there, what's really happening. And fundamentally, what looks like is happening is we had the tripartite Russia, Iran, North Korea closed financial system. In other words, the bubble of deep state money laundering that incorporated the Ukraine situation, right? We've seen that come under control over the last 5 to 7 years between the Helsinki summit with President Trump, then of course the war in Ukraine with President Putin, Russia's disconnection from the SWIFT system. We saw President Trump free Kim Jong-un from the foreign financial cabal emanating primarily from Beijing and from Switzerland. We actually saw Q reference that as a strings cut moment, literally said Kim had his strings cut. So now we have Iran, the third component of that closed financial system, not to be confused with the third component of familial and occultic power in the world, which includes Saudi Arabia, London, Washington, D.C., and the Vatican. But this closed financial system that was insulated from the Western world, but primarily utilized to fund terrorism all throughout the planet, one of the world's largest money laundering operations, perhaps only rivaled by what's going on and what has gone on in Ukraine, that is now coming under essentially patriotic siege. And it's hard for people out there to hear that as I come forth and I say that because fundamentally I'm also on the side of freedom for the parties of both for both sides of the parties involved, right? Both sides of this conflict. I want freedom for the Jewish people. I want freedom for the Iranian people. But we cannot have either if we have a factional intelligence community in control of the localized government apparatus. And with respect to Iran, we also have the component of this foreign financial structure, this insular bubble that was created inside of worldwide markets, but separate from worldwide markets, that essentially allows for a refiring of any sort of criminal activity imaginable if we do not address it. So what's going on right now, in my opinion, is to break the Iranian economic back. It's to force that particular closed system component out into the light with respect to the rest of the world, to force Iran, specifically Tehran, into a situation where they have to participate in a new way of doing things at the international level, at what we would call the economy level, the military and trade level, certainly the sharing of government information and things like that. And with the current Iranian government now fleeing from the inside of the country, again, that government being primarily an extension of the Western world intelligence community, I would say, John, that despite the suffering we see on the ground, and my heart goes out for those involved, we are, however, moving that needle forward at the geopolitical level, which is what this is all about.
Couldn't agree more, as usual, in SG. And as typical with us, customary, there's a lot to unpack. I got several calls over the weekend from people that I trust, our team more precisely trusts, people that were considered some Persian, depending on what part of the side of Iran you're on with the revolution, all too well. And when they were asked about their insights about these nuclear attacks and facilities and the uranium-rich sites, as you said, in Tehran, their exact sentiments, SG, were tears of joy, because they're seeing the regime change from the corrupt Iranian proxies they had prayed to be removed for 40, 50 plus years, whatever it is. And as you rightly said earlier, this affects Iran because a lot of those corrupt Iranian proxies, as my audience knows, have bled themselves into the green zone and parliament of Iraq, because Iraq is, of course, the little brother to Iran. So it all sort of intercorrelates and connects, perfectly. But what we believe we're seeing is as a wholesale regime change, which effectuates the Middle East and other parts. So you're right on the money with what you shared. While this is all happening, SG, gold and silver are up. The dollar index is moving on a downward trajectory. Oil has spiked up temporarily with the scripted conflicts in the Middle East, specifically the Strait of Hormuz. But we believe he's going to make a deal with the drill baby drill to counteract the hyperinflation and make these shifts. How do you see this playing out in the days and weeks ahead? How long can this conflict truly last?
Well, that's sort of an interesting question. I think the conflict itself could last quite a while, but not a longitudinal period like the Russia-Ukraine war, because the objectives fundamentally are completely different, and the infestation and the problem at hand is also completely different. And I would argue with Iran is perhaps even a little less pervasive and entrenched, despite its 50-year history, because you've got a multi-hundred-year history of the situation that's going on right now in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and the Caucasus regions. What I think is really, really interesting with the Iranian conflict more than anything is the fact that it's happening in the present day and in the present time as it is, right after, literally weeks after the Iraqi Baghdad government established a counterterrorism and counterinsurgency task force. And that task force was designed to bring Arab state nations and Arab League nations together. I think they were Gulf Cooperation Council and Arab League nations to come together and essentially discuss how they could prevent their dollars, their resources, their wealth and treasure from being repurposed to finance aims that are fundamentally antagonistic against them. And so that's been just a couple of weeks ago. Now we have this conflict spawning off. And I think it belies a little bit more of what's happening here. We're moving things forward, obviously, very rapidly since April 1st and April 2nd, which President Trump termed Liberation Day here in the United States of America. We're just now coming into about the last third of June or so, headed towards that July 4th holiday. And Iran remains, and the Middle East as a whole, as an operative theater itself, remains one of the only components left on that international economic chessboard in order to arrive at a point where the dollar and the Western world systems need and require a revaluation that the public can both get behind, understand, and that is preparatory, and many components have already been prepared for in the Congress of the United States, like the various bills that are still in committees with respect to Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, CBDCs, gold and silver, and the like. And it's worth keeping in mind that a lot of those bills have not been killed. They've just been tabled for a further time down the line, and they can be recalled for a committee vote and then walked out to a full vote at any point along the way. So this really is, I think, a pivotal convergence of events. Now, you asked a second ago about the energy component of this and the worldwide oil markets and that, raw resource markets that go into energy coming out of this. I think this is also the lead in to a redefinition of some of those markets. We saw the CEO, I think he was the chief spokesman for ConocoPhillips. I want to be clear here with the audience. Come out just recently in an economic forum where he was in the Middle East giving commentary about some of these events. And he stated that President Trump's drill, baby, drill aim was all about ensuring that the domestic production of the United States could meet the input required to keep the country going, or something along those lines. So in my opinion, he's now telling us that we are going to see a transition back to domestic production, and we may see it under the guise of expanding conflict and rising prices as a result of that expanding conflict. And what this does to the Western world SWIFT system, especially in those areas where the money laundering that comes off of large oil sales and nation state level transactions between crude and raw resources and things like that, I think we're seeing that pressure applied now in such a way that it's going to be felt publicly. But we have a contingency plan that has already been going on, that's been happening since Trump first came to office in January of this year, to put us in a position where we can deal with that disconnection. And remember, John, for the audience out there, we're talking about a 60 to 80 year disconnection from the worldwide oil and petrol conglomerate. It really is a historic and multi-generational event that we're living through.
Absolutely. I'm sitting here while I'm listening to you smiling, because we don't script this stuff. You and I don't talk ahead of time. You don't know what questions are coming. That's important for our audiences respectively to know. So the interplay that we always have is fascinating to me. It's just the old, frequency of great minds thinking alike. And he's when I say he, I mean President Trump is, kind of keeping the deep state on their heels, while at the same time, giving a narrative that the public can accept, like, hey, now Iran wants to negotiate, he said earlier this morning, right? So he's playing with them like a cat and mouse. It's fascinating to watch. And we're seeing a lot of the swirling in the different truther groups about, what is he doing? He doesn't know what he's doing. Oh, he does know what he's doing. It's this back and forth. And you can clearly tell it's by design. So with that in mind, SG, it's been stated that President Putin will be one of the ones to establish a peace agreement optically in the Middle East. Do you believe this has to be the case? And will they move summarily to establish a peace agreement in Ukraine as well at the same time? If so, what comes next? China-Taiwan invasion? And is that Israel being saved for last?
Well, now you're getting into the nebulous portion of the conversation, right? The China-Taiwan wild card with all of this is one that, I'll be honest with you, John, has really surprised me with the level of patience and deliberateness that has been maintained with that. And I sort of maintain from my point of view that the reason for that is because whenever we see Beijing and Taipei actually go hot in the Pacific region, we're going to see Tokyo, Seoul, Pyongyang, all of those other major nations, plus the Big Nine, I think is the overall Asian League, or it might be the Big Five. You'll have to forgive me there. But we're going to see all of them economically impacted very, very rapidly, and that's going to deal a potential mortal blow to what's going on in Western world finance markets, especially anything that's tied back to the Japanese yen. So through this period in time, it's very much looking like we're seeing a preparatory, almost like a flow chart put in place where we're attempting to de-escalate what the severity of the next blow is going to be as we move forward in linear time. And it makes sense that the Pacific would actually wind up being last on that chopping block because of what it is able to do to Western world markets, unless we handle that situation and what I would call that fallout very, very delicately, very deliberately, very methodically. So what's happening in the Middle East, I think it is absolutely setting President Putin up to look very good optically in front of the world. We saw Stalin at the Yalta Conference in 1945, so it ties back a little bit symbolically to the large players, to Russia having a large player seat at the table with respect to large sort of international levels of conflict. And I would submit to the audience out there that even though it's mainly undeclared, we have been in a world war style situation the moment Trump came to office and began telling the world that we were going to get control of the financial currency system and the overall manipulation and slave system that existed across our national boundary lines. And now we are seeing pockets of that hot conflict resistance component of that worldwide conflict going active in real time, becoming very much a publicly visible sort of worldwide conflict. So I think we are going to see, like you said, President Putin and President Trump heavily involved in peace deals in the Middle East, probably each from their respective side of the camp, from Putin coming from the Iranian side, President Trump coming from the Western side, the Egyptian side, the Israeli side, things like that. And I can expect on the other side of that, from that point, we would sort of see at that moment whatever next major card our opponent has left to play. I could see a false flag attack attempting to ruin those peace agreements coming about. I could very much see a situation happening in the Pacific theater that sort of accelerates the need to shift the focus internationally to that area, which could destabilize peace arrangements going on in the Middle East that are yet to come, right? But I think this plays out, excuse me, even though it might be a little bit above my pay grade. I apologize. I've been dealing with the throat thing here. But even if it might be a little bit above my pay grade, I could see us flowing this into the Pacific theater in a very significant and potentially even dramatic way. That theater, I don't think, is going to need to be a hot zone for very long. As a matter of fact, I would argue that it would mire us down in the process of moving the needle forward if we have a lot of active island hopping style conflict going on in the Pacific Rim and all around the South China Sea and the Indonesia area. But fundamentally, I do think we're going to see some of that very briefly, and it would make sense to come right after whatever attempted peace arrangements are on the lips of Trump and Putin as recently as 24 hours ago.
Yeah, there's just too many things circumventing SG for it to be a coincidence, as we know. It doesn't really exist. And just got this on Disclosed TV as we're talking SG in real time that President Trump says we're looking beyond a ceasefire with Iran. We're looking to a complete and total victory. And the Q post here, interestingly enough, as you know, 1558, dated June 19th, 7-year Delta. Oh, tomorrow, I should say. Free Iran, fight, 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 regime change. People have the power. We stand with you. So kind of correlates nicely with what you were sharing a moment ago. As you know, we see the recent military parade that took place last week on June 14th, which was also Flag Day and President Trump's birthday, all intertwined. Many comms, as you know, were revealed that day, namely V for Vendetta, the military is in complete control of Washington, D.C., as well as the District of America, and that we are now rapidly moving into the Republic. He also mentioned 3 weeks, which would seem to signal at that point, 4th of July as a massive demarcation point to what you're sharing. What can you tell us about the significance of these comms, as well as anything else that you might have uncovered from said event?
Well, it's very interesting. I was at a family function that day and I wasn't able to dial in as closely as I wanted to, but what I could see of it very much reeked of military ceremony. And when I say military ceremony, I'm talking about ceremony in battle, right? The Romans would come back to Rome and parade in Rome the various prisoners, the various treasure, the various wealth and artifacts that they had taken. What is a little bit lesser well known about history, though, when we look back and read, is that Roman occupying forces in the now conquered territories would conduct the same type of commensurate ceremony in those now conquered territories in whatever ceremonial capital or center of power or locus of power existed, right? And so what we had in Washington, D.C., in my opinion, was a victory parade. And I believe it was a victory parade for World War II. And the reason I say that is because we opened that ceremony primarily with those early era uniforms going back to the 19th and 18th centuries. Then we hit very quickly into the World War II ceremonies, and then we moved forward from that. But the World War II component is one that President Trump highlighted for us just a number of weeks ago, saying that World War II is finally over or something like that, or that we've declared victory in World War II, Victory Day, when he declared the new national holiday. And so we've seen military pomp and circumstance surrounding Washington, D.C. specifically for a number of years now. We've seen fencing up and down. We've seen major, just enormous whole of force style law enforcement activities going on inside DC. The Earth Cam facing the White House has shown us tremendously interesting scenarios over the last 5 years, including what appear to be execution style firing squad bursts coming from inside the White House itself. Now we have this military parade happening in Washington, D.C. On the president's birthday and on Flag Day. And just today or yesterday, I believe it was, we saw not one but 2 new flagpoles placed into the ground at the White House. This is reclamation in real time. This is what it looks like to achieve victory over an opponent and then take all of your opponent's stuff. But it has to be done in an irregular warfare style way because the United States public, unfortunately, is still caught under a great deal of that brainwashing and dream spell style programming coming from those information outlets, and they would simply not understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw the flag being put up this morning, as a matter of fact, on some of the alternative channels. So it's very interesting. And then you had, I believe, 2 nights ago, you had the White House had lights out. So the comms, continue as they, as you said, in a regular and unconventional way. Because again, there's sort of duality for the sheep out there, and then for those of us in the know, they have to do it in a systematic fashion. So thank you for that, SG. I'm going to direct you to my next slide here. Just bear with me a moment here and take you. This is on my Telegram page. I know this came from you directly, so you'll recognize it. Directing your attention to this following slide concerning the new Trump phones. They seem to offer a lot of new items in terms of medical, roadside assistance, and many other things medical. Are these the new Q phones we've heard so much about, or are they in addition to it? Will these phones be able to signal the announcements of both med beds as well as exchange appointments, or the announcement in some form of or fashion of Nassar or Jassar, or whatever they're going to call it? And finally, will the Trump phones have their own carrier as an extension of Starlink?
Well, I have to say on the last part of that question, I honestly don't know, but I certainly hope so. I do want to highlight for the audience that I've not deeply researched this particular topic just yet. It's relatively new, and I just haven't gotten to it on the board, so to speak. But from what I can tell, it's very much an overture to President Trump bringing economic prosperity and permanent economic security back to the United States of America by way of the information age. President Trump utilized the podcast, the alternative media space, really what came about as the MAGA alternative media movement throughout 2020 to 2024 to achieve this re-election in the public eye in 2024, but also to majorly shift the entirety of the consciousness of the population of the United States while he was physically shifting the economic landscape in the background. So this Trump phone, the new Trump mobile, and this sort of hype that surrounds it, I'm very, very intrigued by it. As far as capability, I don't want to opine beyond what I fundamentally know, but I will make it a point to highlight that Henry Ford's Model T was the model that took the industry by storm and became sort of the generally accepted standard for transportation, for logistical communication, for logistical movement here in the United States from a domestic citizenry level. I find that very interesting that this is the T1 phone that's being offered. And again, with the gold plate, an obvious overture to a revaluation, or gold being sort of a intrinsic part of all of this. And President Trump himself, I can't imagine these types of devices not eventually being interlinked with things like Starlink or crypto stablecoin ability, or perhaps being imbued with proper security to be able to maintain certain wallets and things like that on the phone itself. I just don't know enough about it yet to conclusively say that, but I'm really excited to see where this goes.
Yeah, likewise. I just wanted to kind of take your temperature on it since it came through your wheelhouse, and that's great about the Model T example. I hadn't considered that, so invaluable insights right there once again, SG. And yes, everybody knows he loves gold, so it is an obvious common. T-Mobile, for example, is already one of the, I'm sure several carriers who already have the beta testing Starlink out there, because they've sent that to me months ago. So that would seem to stand to reason. So thank you for that. As I go to the next set of slides, SG here, this namely has to do with the crypto front at this point, as you'll see. So we see that both Ripple and SEC are renewing efforts to resolve optically the long-standing, nearly 5-year argument that will release XRP in order to finally flourish it. Additionally, we see Vietnam. I'm going to try to bring that over here to you. Here's an example also from a Real Deegan holder saying about 58.9 billion in XRP in circulation. That came from one of our team members, Veronica. And then segueing over to Vietnam, they passed a law recently that recognizes crypto assets. So Vietnam has infinitely more natural assets such as gold, more than I think most people realize. Brazil recently announced their inclusion of Vietnam into BRICS, as well as Iraq's strong desire to join the WTO. What does this mean to you in terms of the global reset and XRP being the digital convergence that makes everything synergize?
Well, legitimately, I think you're seeing it on display in real time with things like this. And also from the fact that in the last 24 to 36 hours, we saw an XRP exchange traded fund go live inside the Canadian marketplace. And so that's only going to impact and eventually proliferate throughout the Western world markets, even if it takes a minute to come to the U.S. side. We're seeing the build out, in my opinion, over the recent weeks and months, especially pertaining to XRP, but the overall cryptocurrency landscape itself, the build out for the public to not only accept an alternate economic way of life, or perhaps an additional economic way of life is a better way to say it, but also for them to understand it, to understand how it works, to understand how it moves. XRP is a movement token. It's an infrastructural component more than it's a recognized financial evaluation instrument, right? It helps facilitate the transactive abilities. We're going to see more, I think, coming and spinning off of that as we go forward over the coming months and years with respect to XRP's capabilities and any sub tokens that come into the fore and into the orbit that begin working directly with XRP. Plus, we have President Trump that has indicated he intends to create this cryptocurrency stablecoin reserve here in the United States, and that XRP is one of those eventual coins that's going to be included in that. We would not be including that or any other coin if it wasn't going to be important to the foundational underpinnings of this blended ecosystem that we're now sort of coming into and creating. And I'm seeing it sort of happening very slowly at first. In some way, John, although I wasn't there, obviously, I would liken it to how I've read about the evolution of steam technology throughout the early 19th century, and then moving forward towards the 20th century, and how it was very subtle and very pocketed and compartmented at first, and then it became a massive flood, and very quickly after that became the industry standard in the entirety of the Western world, including the United States. I'm seeing a similar situation sort of being prepared here. And when we take that with what's happening inside Iran, for example, what is soon going to be happening on the Korean Peninsula, in my opinion, what is continuing to happen inside the Ukrainian dynamic and Russia's conflict there, we're seeing, again, the put down, the smothering, if you will, of this alternative system, this sort of shadow state ecosystem that existed as a counterbalance in the background to SWIFT already. That had to be addressed as well throughout the conversion process of SWIFT itself publicly as an international, publicly visible means of communicating and transacting with one another. And now we're seeing, in my opinion, the pivot point, the pivoting happening at this period of time, moving us towards that next blended ecosystem while tying off the final major parts of this other problematic system that's been in place for literally hundreds of years.
Yeah, agreed. I've always sort of classified XRP as the gold standard of the cryptos, at the top of the chain. And it's the emulsifier that we see that makes all the other financial instruments go, namely the bonds like ZIM, foreign currencies, other cryptos, precious metals, because they're sort of obviously all intertwined under the foundational underlayment of gold, since there's, as you know, the world is awash with it. So that would certainly make sense and corroborate with what you're saying. These last few questions, SG, are going to sort of fall under the under category, or miscellaneous, if you will. I remember back in January when we spoke earlier this year, you said that you thought the public would most likely get access to Medbeds by September. Do you still believe this to be the case, or is it event driven? And if it is, what specific events do you think people will need to see in order to facilitate that happening for people, especially those in the greatest of need?
Well, that's a very interesting question, I have to say. And I would say I'm probably going to stick with my original time frame, but give people some leniency and some grace to understand that it's always event driven, and how quickly we move through this particular process and what we're able to accomplish in each specific window of time will yield itself to the next window. Even God sort of understood this when he created the signs and the seasons for the heavens, right? There's a time to grow, a time to harvest, a time to plant, a time to nurture. Ecclesiastes, I think, talks about it in one of their chapters. And so when we look at what's happening in this present day and time, it looks like we're seeing a coordinated assault from the United States government executive branch angled in two main areas: the financial reset itself and facilitating that progression forward and concluding that process, and also getting the health and wellness crisis, the disease crisis that exists inside the United States and really in the entirety of the former Commonwealth realms, sort of reining that in and arresting that momentum. And so in that sense, I would think that we would see a tremendous amount of events transpire between now and July 4th, and then July 4th onward towards probably September 11th would be the next major symbolic and indicative date here in the United States to progress us forward on those two big fronts, because those are the ultimate fronts that the deep state fights us for. It's not energy, it's not even money in some regards, although the money comes back to it, but it is the ability to self determine value, and it is the ability to maintain health, wellness, and vitality, and to cultivate our spiritual connection, which comes from that. When we have unadulterated DNA flowing through us, when our cells are unmitigated with things like poisons and venoms and all sorts of craziness that comes into the toxicological component, we are incredibly powerful, very centered, extremely calm, clear minded, and intelligent beings that you really cannot pull the wool over. And that's why they have worked so hard and spent wealth uncalculable over the last 1,000+ years to try and separate us from exactly that. So, in that sense, I would say that as we go throughout this year, even if it's not by the September period, even if it's closer to the end of Q3 or Q4, I can anticipate us making very big leaps and strides on the health and wellness fronts and the financial fronts. And the Medbed component, I think, would naturally fit into that discussion.
Yeah, I completely agree because, as I was listening to you and just kind of thinking about it, sort of mentally putting the comms together from your comms. It's Ecclesiastes 3, by the way. I think you were looking for a time and a season for everything. And right. So there's that. We look at, I think the financial reset will sort of be the tipping point for the med beds, because that's ultimately through certain bonds is what's going to fund it, right? At its deep construct. And then you look at, it may not correlate, it may, I don't know, just throwing it out there, but you look at RFK Jr., now with General Mills removing dyes, you're seeing a lot of processed foods being, put in check. I was talking to a family member the other day and getting their produce. It's now starting to come slowly in America, from America. So you're seeing this phase out and phase in process, right? So I would, we also have somebody in our team who's has an estimable value in the financial world. And he believes very strongly that September 11th, not coincidentally to your date, is most likely a very close marker to where we would see at least a flash crash in the stock market. So that kind of lines up nicely with what you were sharing. President Trump was in Canada, SG, this week, as you know, for the G7 briefly and left after a day. A lot of deep state actors were there for him to confront. Were you surprised that he chose to attend the event? And if not, what did that signal to you? Is it to expose the deep state for the world to see? Or is it also maybe the introductory point of bringing Canada in as a 51st state? Both, or maybe something else altogether?
Well, I have to say, in my opinion, John, and this is just my opinion based on some of the research I put together and the contextual history that I have with the subject and the perspective I bring to it, it very much looks like the G7 had nothing to do with why President Trump actually went to Canada. In my opinion, he was there coinciding with the G7 because you had lots of other Western world Kabbalist players and nations at the table to assert his sovereignty over the Canadian territory as the president of the United States and of an overarching North American protective style military operation. And when we saw the conversation between him and Prime Minister Carney, did you notice that Prime Minister Carney was sitting in front of the American flag and President Trump was sitting in front of the Canadian flag? We also saw President Trump wearing a lapel pin right beneath the American flag lapel pin that he always has, which was the American and Canadian flags interwoven together in a slightly smaller gradient. So you have the American flag on top, full size, and you had this sort of half-size flag pin utilizing both of them underneath there. That was absolutely symbolic, and that's something we have to keep in mind. In irregular warfare, in espionage-style communications, when things are needing to be conveyed to the publicly visible world without tipping off one's opponent or one's enemy, they're conveyed in extraordinarily subtle ways. It is purposefully by design that they're placed, the communication substance is placed in the areas where most people would think nothing of it, such as apparel or body language or gesture or placement of things in the background. And so we saw President Trump up there for less than 36 hours, if I remember correctly. He's back to the United States almost immediately after making that on the ground physical public appearance. And so again, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, what we were seeing with that was the receptivity, the handing off of the Canadian Crown Corporation to the President of the United States of America.
Glad you said that. Yeah, the pin lapel I did notice. The flag part I didn't quite catch. So that's great observation on your point, and that's what it suggested to me as well. Is it was sort of an optical sign of the commingling or merging that's going to happen between the two countries into one. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. SG, I'm going to give you, this will be my final question for you. This is one that my team was adamant that I ask you about. So I'm going to cue up the video here. If you just bear with me a moment, and I'm going to play it for you, and then I will ask you a couple of questions on said video, and I'll give you a chance to catch your breath at the same time. So let's watch this video clip, and then I'll talk to you about it.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Mr. President, on behalf of the United States Army, the Army Golden Knights, I would like to present to you this flag, which was flown over our nation's capital in free fall during the Army's 250th birthday celebration.
Okay, so we see that clip there, SG. So notice how Melania stepped in front of President Trump. He shifted just behind her. So the question is, was that Melania acting as the queen, protecting the king in a chess move versus the Q post? Is this an example of the queen's gambit? And did the soldier presenting the flag, was that symbolic of us overcoming the cabal corporation and going back into the republic?
We captured their flag, John. And so as we look at what, that video, there's a lot of things we could talk about in that video. Melania's dress color, for example, sort of eggshell white with this very pure, demure look. The gentleman that comes forward, the Golden Knights, right? Knights serve the royalty, knights serve the queen. Knights, acted in service of either the Vatican through a secret brotherhood or through aristocracy and the monarchy in days past. And most of your audience out there is probably going to be aware, but I'm just going to give a cursory summary for those that may not be. Melania Trump has a phenomenal and fascinating background. And if you're really dogged about tracing that lineage, you'll find that it likely goes back to Anastasia Romanov. And so when you appreciate that that could actually be at play here, I've never been able to fully corroborate it, but the evidence is pretty compelling. The circumspect evidence, I should say, is pretty compelling. It very much looks like you had the unification of almost what you would say the proper forces for authoritative good in the background long before this operation in 2016, 17, and 18 really got underway. So now we have the flag, the crown, or excuse me, the American U.S. corporation flag flown over Washington, D.C. during the Army's victory parade, now being given to the President of the United States, also the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces, who happens to be married to the rightful Russian queen and lineage going back a number of hundreds of years. And the flag is being presented by the Golden Knights. Again, I'm going to highlight that that's not an accident. You're seeing both gold and knight coming into that. With respect to placement of Melania, queen protecting the king is exactly what I drew from that as well. And it wasn't but just a couple of days after this event, 2 or 3 days, I think, that we saw the occurrences that we did really beginning to escalate and ramp up inside of the Middle East. And so that ties us back to this idea of gold, revaluation, monetary changeover, getting this foreign insular financial system, which a great deal of it was made possible through sellout and traitorous Russian oligarchs tying back to Moscow and other areas inside Russia. So that would be sort of an intrinsically interested area that I think Melania would have from her own personal vantage point, if I could be so brazen. But we're seeing all of that now pop off immediately after this event. I don't see how it gets any more obvious for folks out there unless they're just not willing to open those eyes a little bit further and appreciate the nonverbal communication. And we are living in an era, I can't stress this enough, where nonverbal and symbolic communication rules the day, because we're dealing with an enemy, an entrenched opponent that has ruled us sort of in a sleight of hand, deceptive disinformation style way, utilizing those exact same tactics for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we are going to defeat them with their own book.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you said that part about the lineage of Melania's background too, because I had heard a while ago that President Putin was sort of giving Melania as a gift to President Trump on a multitude of fronts. So that seems to sort of marry well with what you just shared. So it's just fascinating to watch all this stuff as this convergence of events comes together into sort of the grand climax, if you will. So always a pleasure, SG. I love working with you. It's great. And we really thank you for all of your fabulous insights and decodes. As we wrap up this podcast, as I always do with you, SG, last thoughts for the audience and where can people find your work?
Well, I can be found in 4 places online. I'm on rumble.com /user/Q News Patriot. I'm not on Rumble by the name SG Anon. And I can be found in 3 other places: Truth Social, X, and Telegram. I'm on Truth at the handle real SG Anon with a red check mark. I'm on X at the handle THEQ News Patriot with a blue check mark. And I'm on Telegram at the address t.me/real Q News Patriot. And with respect to final thoughts, John, I think my final thoughts would be that, Q told us that the end is not for everyone, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the end is a bad thing. Not for everyone could mean that we just don't fully grasp the entirety of the picture and we're sort of rattling our own cage internally when we don't really need to. And I would submit that many of us out there are probably witnessing that occurring out in the online and digital space right now. So I would admonish folks out there, steady as she goes, give it a little bit of patience, let it play out, see how these types of events actually occur. President Trump ran on an anti-war, fair and just America First platform. The man is not an ignorant human being. He built a multi-billion-dollar, or maintained, I should say, a multi-billion-dollar real estate development and business enterprise. He understands how deals are made and how things work. So again, I would just caution everyone, give it some time, let it play out, have a little bit of faith. We've already won this in certain ways.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. We'll leave those links that you mentioned, as always, in the description. And folks, if you are looking for foreign currencies, Iraq dinar, Vietnamese dong, Thai baht, Venezuelan bolivar, Zim bonds, and the like, as one of our chief sponsors of the podcast, or you're looking to add to the cachet what you already have, we will leave that link in the description. SG Anon, thanks for being here, good sir. Always a pleasure. Thanks for your time, graciousness, and we look forward to talking with you very shortly.
Thanks for having me, John. God bless. I look forward to coming back.
God bless.